I feel like a lot of where we're at today is not too dissimilar from the 1910s before World War I starts. All of the disenchantment with liberal modernity is already in the water before the World War starts, right? You have all these anarchist bombings, SARS are being shot, presidents in America are being shot, Theodore Roosevelt's giving speeches saying we're literally on the gates of Armageddon. In the late 21st century, you see a move to the moral person is seen to be the person who is the victim in the situation. Victimhood confers moral authority. And my speculation is, why does this happen? Why does victimhood become such a key part of the way we think about politics today and also about like social action? And if you look at like the classic examples of kind of like woke agitation, for example, on like college campuses in America, this is entirely what it is. It's much more of a no, we're going to appeal to university authorities. Yeah. We're going to create such a ruckus and show that we are in moral need that they'll be shamed or otherwise like morally impelled to act on our side and change the rules. A lot of dysfunction in the modern world is people who do not feel like masters of their fate and their perception is accurate. They're not really. Most of the things that decide their daily life are beyond their scope of control. The trouble though is the generations that come after. Because if you are one of these potential people who might have the capacity to solve a problem, but you're always waiting for the person higher up to make the decision. Then when you eventually climb through the ranks and become the person who is tasked with solving that problem, or problems in general, you have no experience doing so.
Welcome to Uncomfortable Collisions with Reality with me, Nicholas Gruen, and my friend and colleague, Peyton Bowman, and we have with us Tanner Greer, who I will briefly introduce and then ask him to introduce himself further if he thinks there are some further things to say. I'll do that now. Tanner is, I shall get my notes, Tanner is the director of the Centre for Strategic Translation, and that involves translating Chinese material for the benefit of mainly Americans, but Westerners. The idea being that if we don't, we need to engage with, or at least understand, the people who matter most to us outside of our own country. Not a subject that the United States, like most empires, hasn't been exemplary at. On all occasions. He also wrote an essay which I took a shine to, and we'll talk about that. It's called A School of Strength and Character. So, Tanner, welcome to our little podcast.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Yeah, that's all good. I run the think tank whose job is to help the West try to understand what is going on in the minds of the Communist Party of China. And a lot of my public writing has to do with China, but not all of it. For a long, long time, I had a blog. I still do. It's called The Scholar's Stage. And a lot of the ideas that were in that essay were originally written on that blog in different points. I have maybe 12 or so pieces that kind of explore similar themes. And so when I'm not writing about China or Chinese history, I'm often writing about American history, American conservatism, and institutional history and what makes institutions work. Those are topics that fascinate me. And a lot of my work before I was directing a think tank was just as a writer, journalist, and public intellectual. And that was one of the themes I returned to quite often.
And are you, like I would describe myself, as a kind of not exactly a refugee of academia, because I never went into academia, but I realized that if I wanted to think for myself, academia was not necessarily the best place to do it. And so I had to make other plans. Is that any part of your background or thinking?
Yeah. I mean, so, I did the normal bachelor's degree, studied history, political science, that sort of stuff. And then I went out to Asia, lived there for 5 years in Taiwan and Beijing, that sort of things. Yeah. And I never really entered the whole world of higher education, partially because it didn't seem necessary, believe it or not. And one of the benefits I have of kind of my path is I've been able to put my finger in many pies, so to speak, write about things that are widely disparate, and see the connection between these things. And it's kind of unfortunate that is not as encouraged in academia as it could be.
It is kind of unfortunate. I would have to agree with that. Okay, well, look, your essay, and I will put a link to it in the show notes. It's in a fairly new online magazine called Palladium, which often has excellent articles in it. This is one of them, one of the best, I think. It's called A School for Strength and Character. So I'm going to ask you, Tanner, to just don't tell us everything about it. We'll try and work our way through many of its claims and themes. But if I gave you 30 seconds or a minute to say something like what it's about, or why you wrote it, why you think somebody needed to write it, or why someone should read it, your time starts now.
So a consistent theme that I've been investigating for 5 or 6 years now in different pieces is trying to understand what might be called the lack of institutional capacity in the West, and different sources for this. And one of the conclusions I've come to is that in some ways we've socialized ourselves into having less capacity than we should. The phrase that I keep coming back to, and I believe it appears in that article or some version of it, is that the current mode we've been trained into is when we encounter a novel problem, it's not, the question we ask is not, how do we act together to solve this problem, but how do we get management on our side?
Yeah, that's right. From your essay, the first instinct of the 19th century American was to ask, how can we make this happen? Those raised inside the bureaucratic maze have been trained to ask a different question. How do I get management to take my side?
Yes, that's right. And so this piece, like I've actually written quite a bit on what it looks like now and why it looks like that now that we go to management. This piece was an attempt to try and investigate, well, okay, how did the world work before bureaucracy? What was the motive force in that world?
Yeah.
And that's what that piece tries to lay out. It looks at 19th century America as a large industrial and like large scale polity that nevertheless was not run through very large complex bureaucracies, and tries to investigate both the social conditions that allow that to happen and then what kind of character formation that created in leaders rising up. And by implication, it's kind of a statement also on the character formation of leaders today. But it mostly examines what the past looked like. Basically from 1820 through about 1910 is kind of the range that essay looks at.
It's interesting. One of my thoughts is that if we're thinking about, say, Russia and Ukraine right now, we're focusing on the wrong world war. We're focusing on we spend all our time thinking about Munich and the Second World War, and I don't actually mind that because I think that Putin needs to be resisted. But we should also think about the First World War, where and NATO looks to me exactly like all these alliances in the First World War that immediately produced a world war out of some skirmishing in Europe. But the reason I was mentioning this is that I recently read a book called Young Radicals. I don't know whether you're familiar with it, by a guy called Jeremy McCarter, who is a sort of business partner, a collaborator with Lin-Manuel Miranda, the author of Hamilton.
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with that book?
I'm not familiar with it. Forgive me.
Yeah, well, it's a pretty interesting book, and it's about, you have the long 19th century, and then bang, World War I just smashes everybody's expectations, and just brings about a completely different world. And that, to me, I think is something that is like you looking at 19th century America, just looking at the transformations and looking at the ways people's deep expectations, they just understood very quickly how they'd been dashed. And again, I think that's something similar to that has happened in Westerners' understanding of democracy. I think Westerners would be, if you introduced an American from Reagan's time or an Australian from Bob Hawke's time, they'd be pretty surprised at how bad things have got as far as governing ourselves is concerned, and how suddenly a lot of that has happened. Anyway, you guys, sorry, you're going to react.
Have you read the World of Yesterday?
Stefan Zweig. It's funny you should mention it. I have, yes. Because he was a close friend of my grandmother. So there you go.
Oh,
how about that? We're wondering. Some of my cousins wonder just how close a friend he was. Anyway, go on.
I just mentioned it because it has similar themes to World War I as kind of the breaking point. I mean, things were already. I actually think that if we're going to make that comparison, and this is far afield from
yes, it is.
my essay, but it's not that unrelated to other things I've written about when I look at American conservatives in particular and their debates and stuff.
Yeah.
We're, in my mind, I think a little bit, if I'm looking at the American perspective, I feel like a lot of where we're at today is not too dissimilar from the 1910s before World War I starts. All of the disenchantment with like liberal modernity is already in the water before the World War starts, right? You have all these anarchist bombings, SARS are being shot, presidents in America are being shot. You have socialist radicals doing things all over the world. Theodore Roosevelt's giving speeches saying we're literally on the gates of Armageddon. People, I think, actually kind of forget how much. And there's all this like new stuff in the water, Freud and Darwin, things like that seem to be eroding the previous conception as individuals, as dignified souls that could then communicate with each other and then lead to perfection. So it's already starting to degrade. And then World War I like ends it because it's a very, very conclusive demonstration that like the world that had been created wasn't leading somewhere good. People are dying, and the material basis of the previous world, like the social structure, the aristocracy and stuff, is kind of completely wiped out in World War I. And so in my mind, if we're going to really pursue the analogy, like this is why we don't want a war with China.
Because I'm really in favor of trying to avoid wars. You could, just this close to being a pacifist, I'm not a pacifist at all, but by God, you want to go a long way to avoid a really big war.
Well, yeah, I mean, so this is like, people say, oh, there's like, fascism in the United States and stuff. I don't really think so, but I feel like, oh yeah, like if we lost the war with China, there would be. That's kind of like the point. Like the stuff is in the water. It's there. The ideas have emerged. All that's missing is a Great Depression or World War level crisis that would fundamentally break things apart and like unleash these things. That's if we're gonna kind of make that take, I feel like we're somewhere similar to where a lot of Europe and even America was in like 1910, intellectually. But that's kind of far afield from like what is in my essay.
Yeah, it is. Maybe if you want to, after we've recorded, you might want to shoot me an email and I'll put up another link to some of this stuff if you've got an essay you might want to draw attention to it. I'd certainly be interested to read it. So back to the essay, you talked about institutional capacity. I was thinking maybe we should define that a bit more. Certainly America has, I guess, because America so valued its capability, because America has such a can-do self-image, trying to build infrastructure in America and noticing that it can't be done, it comes as a pretty terrible shock. And also, I mean, I think of the gerontocracy of the late Soviet Union, and then I look at the United States and I see Nancy Pelosi, and at least she's compos mentis. But then we have Dianne Feinstein and Donald Trump and Joe Biden, and it's a pretty ugly story. The next presidential election will be between two people whose average age is 80. That's pretty extraordinary. Yeah, sorry. So do you want to say something?
Yeah, no, like I think if we're thinking about like, okay, what does institutional capacity mean or whatever, there's different ways you could look at it. A very, very popular one, among certain types is to do exactly what you said with the infrastructure, right? I think California just announced a few days ago that they've dropped $8 billion on a high-speed rail, which hasn't had a line of rail actually built yet. And then it might be $90 billion more. It was originally supposed to cost $1 billion. Yeah. And so that's an extreme statistic. It seems extraordinary that, a country like China can just go and build these out the wazoo, whereas we have struggled to do even a very short, railway line or a tunnel or something like that. And so that's one very dramatic example that I think people have a very intuitive understanding of. In some cases, it has unique drivers. There's a fair number of people who have written, for example, about what they call the veto-ocracy in American life. That there's lots of, there's too many veto points for things getting done, too many communities, too many stakeholders are given a voice. And that's a part of it. But I think there's a whole nother realm of explanation. And maybe a different example helps bring this out. I think it's very instructive to compare the initial months of the 1919 pandemic, the Spanish flu in America, with the coronavirus pandemic. And how they responded. So when the pandemic started, I started reading some books about, past pandemics and stuff just to get a sense of what was going on. One of the ones I read that was very interesting was a book by what's her name? I think it's Nancy Bristow. And she describes how at each and every city in the country, within a week of there being a Spanish flu case in a city, you would have the creation of an emergency committee. Sometimes these are at the state level, other times at the county or city, most of them are at the city. And on these emergency committees, you'd have representatives from the state and city health departments, from the Red Cross, the military, usually the churches involved, sometimes the largest businesses in said city, and then often a representative from the National Health Service that had those uniformed officers back in the day. And they would immediately, so within months of this starting, you have dozens of institutions set up across the country to try and manage the response in their own locality. These were created in a very bottom-up fashion. They were created with a whole host of leaders from different institutions. And then when the pandemic was over, they're all disbanded. Something very, very similar had happened about the same time, because this is World War I we're talking about, for the creation of war bonds. Almost the same people, actually, all got together and created war bond drives in order to help fund the war. Again, very bottom-up creation. Might have responded to central signals, but not, in a big hierarchical sense. If you contrast this to what happened in America, where for the first 3 months, America, the coronavirus pandemic, for the first 3 months, you had officials, both Democrats and Republicans, denying there was even a problem, because they didn't want to deal with it. And then when they did happen, everything just kind of got pushed up to the federal government to deal with. And it was often very, very incompetent.
They did a terrible thing.
Local capacity. And you could look at, the 1919 ones and say, okay, did they really succeed that much? They weren't that successful because they didn't have a good understanding of germ theory at the time. They couldn't see viruses under microscopes. So they weren't as successful as they could have been, except in terms of making sure there was nurses to care for people, many of whom died because of the way that disease affected young people. But it was very amazing to me to read this account of all these committees being set up almost spontaneously to solve a national problem, and then just at the same time watch America for months and months and months struggle to come up with any institutional response that was coherent at any level. It was an amazing failure at not just the federal level with Trump and the CDC, although it was a failure there, but also the state level, the local level. It was a terrible indictment of American society in my mind. That we were not able to pull together and act effectively.
So I remember. Now, I think Australia, well, different people will have different views. I think Australia did somewhat better, but there was a lot of luck involved. But we made the same kinds of mistakes. And I remember that when when we decided to get serious about the coronavirus, our chief scientist called Brendan Murphy, people said, well, shouldn't we be wearing masks? And he said, no, don't wear masks. It's not, he basically gave a bullshit answer, a public bullshit answer, which he subsequently defended as bullshit because he was trying to protect the mask supply, which is sort of bullshit in itself, because if you wanted to protect the mask supply, you would commandeer the mask supply. You wouldn't just sort of try and bullshit people. And I thought to myself, I mean, what's happening here is that there's an almost complete lack of people with some knowledge. It might be first aid knowledge, it might be much deeper medical knowledge, working out what to do and applying that knowledge and saying, we think you should do this. They were waiting for the CDC or the World Health Organization to come up with a ruling. So it was actually a bureaucratic response to the deployment of expertise. And the experts at the top were careerists, and they were pretty awful at the way they did what they did. And the other thing that was quite extraordinary was that there were quite well-developed pandemic, or varying between countries, quite well-developed pandemic plans. In hindsight, I mean, in fact, there's some quite amusing stuff where there was, I think Johns Hopkins had an index. The way to get in the news these days, the way to get coverage in the press is to come up with an index, and you have a rank of countries, and then everybody then that turns it into news. And they had an index of pandemic readiness, and there was no correlation between their index and how well people did. And the pandemic preparedness had been based on almost everyone had prepared for a flu epidemic, and it wasn't a flu. And it took about over a month before anyone in any country, any official in any country, said we'd better revise our plan based on what we know, which is that it's not a flu, it's something different to that. And that was New Zealand. But it was an incredibly rare thing. And instead you had these medical officials handing out, making rules, which in a sense you want them to make the rules, but not showing any kind of problem-solving reason in the way that they conducted themselves.
It's really interesting because as a point of comparison, I live in Tokyo, and to kind of put the cart before the horse, there are a lot of these kinds of committees that I think you talk about in your article that existed in the 19th century in America, and they're still kind of operating in some ways in Japan. In fact, I signed up to read books at my daughter's school and ended up on a kind of committee where I had to have this meeting with all these other people in the PTA. We had meeting notes, kind of a lot of formal structure to it. Didn't have to take an oath to the reading group, fortunately, but it had a lot of kind of like a lot of the structure of some of these old meetings, and there are a lot of these kinds of informal, I think, committees being formed, neighborhood committees. I think, for example, when there's a bear terrorizing a local community in Japan, there's usually a committee that's a group of local hunters, volunteer hunters, and police officers working together to shoot the bear. They don't just go out and shoot it themselves, like on Yellowstone or some TV show like that, you know what I mean? So, and I thought it was interesting because the reaction to the coronavirus pandemic here was, at some level, there was a lot of kind of misconduct at that top national level in government, but there was also a lot of really kind of informal organizing. Most famously, people are still kind of wearing masks around here. That's sort of voluntary, but there's also a sense in which if a kid got sick at school or a parent got sick at school, each situation was viewed a little bit like, how do we solve this together as a community, as opposed to let's go report this to the health department and get our instructions from them and then complain about them, or whatever it might be. So I don't know if you've spent a lot of time in East Asia. I don't know how much you know about Japan. It'd be interesting to get your perspective on that. But if not, I think a good thing for us to talk about is how these 19th century organizations operated.
And how they're different to modern ones.
Effective in building institutional capacity, as we've talked about before.
Yeah, well, let me, like Nicholas, you were mentioning earlier this, like Australians, which I'm not super familiar with the COVID situation or how it was managed in Australia, so I'm just going off of what you said, assuming that it was a true and accurate representation. But you mentioned that you have all these people who potentially might have the capacity to solve problems, who are waiting on the people basically higher up to make decisions.
Yeah.
And this is there's a problem with this dynamic. Hierarchy and bureaucracy, in my mind, is an extremely useful tool for accomplishing large-scale things. It can be an extremely powerful tool. The problem is what happens, and this is why like the people who invented bureaucracy, who were raised in the world before it, say, for example, the Americans who kind of like won World War II and created up an entire, national security state, were extremely effective at using bureaucratic tools for whatever ends they chose.
Yeah.
The trouble, though, is the generations that come after. Because if you are one of these potential people who might have the capacity to solve a problem, but you're always waiting for the person higher up to make the decision. Then when you eventually climb through the ranks and become the person who is tasked with solving that problem, or problems in general, you have no experience doing so. And that's the essential, I think, my argument about institutional capacity, is that knowing how, I sometimes describe it as cultures that know how to build. It requires a culture of problem solving at lower levels if you're ever going to train people who will be effective at doing it at higher levels. And so that's my I guess central indictment of, I don't know, the modern world in some ways, is that people live so much under bureaucratic structures that deny them that agency. That once you actually do have leaders that matter, they have no practical experience wielding agency. 19th century America was in this way very different. They were very good at getting people to act as like independent agents. They would usually use the word 19th century, they would just call it self-government. Usually that's what they would use to describe this phrase. Or sometimes they would use the word independency. This was something that was inculcated very young, starting perhaps even in grade school, if you're going to believe people like Alexis de Tocqueville's, observations on American kids and a lot of these other 19th century visitors to the United States were very impressed with how much agency even the children had in determining their own fates. So we could talk a bit more about that. That's one of the things I frame in the article, is all these visitors. I read many books from people mostly from Europe coming to the United States in that time, and their impressions of what made American life different.
Well, could you talk a little bit about how? So I think people are familiar with the idea of a large organization still today that have these sort of individual chapters, right? Like you could think of fraternities or sororities or something like that. But how is that structure different from an organization that follows, let's say, Peter Drucker's, principles of management or something along these lines?
Okay. Well, I think we can even start a step earlier and see kind of how things are built up. In 19th century America was a pioneer country, which meant that if you were to go and settle in Minnesota or Utah, where my ancestors settled, or wherever, you literally had to build every single institution yourself. If there was a police department, if there was a mayor's office, if there was a congregation for church, if there was a school board or a schoolhouse, it's because you yourself got together with a band of fellow citizens in that area and created that thing, be it physical or institutional. this is why I describe them as a culture that builds in some ways, because they themselves were constantly building institutions in a way that I think modern Americans have very little experience with, because we just inherited everything. And a lot of these institutions were of necessity on the local scale. They were, like you said, like the PTA committee. That's just, although PTAs actually are a large membership organization of this structure, but they were built by people bottom up to solve local problems locally. However, 19th century America wasn't limited to that. It had a large number of those, and that was an important part of the story. But they were also like many, many national organizations, the largest being the two major political parties that stretched across the country, some of which did very, very important things. I think in the essay I mentioned the committees for the Sanitary Commission in the Civil War. Was a chapter-based organization that helped provide medical care for the entire Union Army, independent of the government originally, and then eventually got funding from it. And these organizations worked in a pretty standard way. They were often patterned on each other. By the way, a good book to read about this is Theda Scott Cole's Diminished Democracy, which is kind of a history of these organizations from their 19th century peak to their late 20th century fall. And the way chapter-based organizations work is pretty simple. Each locality will have its own chapter. Chapters are usually based geographically. Most chapters had elected leadership, elected at the local level. And these organizations would pay dues to the central level, but most of their dues would cover activities at the bottom. And at each level, you would have things like the people who are at the very top of these organizations. So if it's like the Christian Temperance Union or something like that, which whose goal was to get rid of alcohol consumption or reduce it.
Yeah, the goal was prohibition.
Right. Well, so they did it more than one way. They would either do it through prohibition, or the other thing they would do is they go on these speaking tours and try to get people to kind of, make commitments to stop drinking and stuff. In the 1820s, they reduced the temperance movement as a whole. Was able to reduce the amount of drinking that happened in America by eightfold between 1820 and 1840. And that was without using legal.
Is this the same time? Is this the same time as the Great Awakening, or is that a bit earlier?
Yes, it is. And many of the Second Great Awakening people were core to this organizing, explosion. This is also an abolitionism and anti-slavery organizing. Also comes out of the same intellectual social milieu. But the Christian and the Women's Christian Temperance Union is a later version of that. It's founded a little bit later, but it's off of that same kind of initial foundation. And if you're one of those people, if you're the leader of that organization, your job is basically to constantly tour from locality to locality and train all these lower level leaders, tell them what's working in other places, hold big conferences where you grab all the people together and you talk with each other and stuff, and you might lay out national plans. If you are the leader, you're democratically elected by the leaders below you, who are in turn chosen by the people below them, and then the people below them are the general membership.
True.
But by and large, it's very self-directed at the local level. You're able to have national coherence, but it's not a complete top-down hierarchy. It's almost really building from the bottom up.
Yeah, exactly. It's a bottom-up hierarchy, and it's. I mean, I suppose all hierarchies are modular in a way, but it's modular in a sort of behavioural sense. The people who get elected are the people, typically, I imagine, who impress the people that they've been elected from, and that's very different to the rules of a bureaucracy where people get a lot of power at the top and sound chaps, as we call them here, people who are known as a safe pair of hands. They don't have to be chaps, they can be chapettes, but they're people whose manner is reassuring. They mightn't be much good, they might be good. That's really not that important. What's important is just keeping people happy, and that's the skill, and the skill of appearing competent. These things are very highly regarded, and in Australia they take you. In Australia, with a bit of luck, they take you all the way to the very top honour that we give out, which is called a Companion of the Order of Australia. but usually with some other conspicuous accomplishment, but not always. And it's quite different. The organisations you describe, I think one can imagine the ethos of them is very different. And you have a nice expression, which I'm going to try and find if I can find it quickly, but I'm not sure that I can. It's a 2-word expression, just a summary. Lodge democracy, you call it. I don't know whether you want to say that's exactly what you're talking about, but that term turns up. And it's that idea, because I've been thinking a lot about democracy, it's that idea that it seemed to me, there was we were thinking in a similar kind of way, even if we may not end up thinking in the same way, but we're thinking along similar lines.
Well, what I think is key here is not just the bottom-upness of these organizations, because not all of the organizations at the time were that bottom-up. Some of them did have more top-down selection, although most of them were bottom-up elected. But what really, I think, distinguished them from a lot of modern organizations is the extent to which local units were given autonomy.
Yeah.
If you were in charge of the local temperance union or the local Elks Lodge or whatever it might be, most of your guys' activities were chosen and directed at your level. And ultimately, there was not a lot of ways to force somebody lower down to do it. And that's important because we're talking about democracy. This is a word whose meaning, I think, has significantly shifted, especially in the American context, from the 19th century to now. In the 19th century, democracy meant, self-government. It meant a large number of people actively engaged in tasks of governing or managing their lives collectively. This doesn't happen very much today. I think a lot of politics today, people vote. But that's one decision every so many years. If it's something like a national election, that's at a very, very far remove. Your individual voice and actions don't matter very much. Whereas if you're doing something like your local elk lodge's, charity event for the widows in the town, and you're trying to solve that problem yourself, you are actively engaged in all the tasks of self-government. Building coalitions, finding solutions. And these organizations actually, in the American context, would actually advertise that. They would say, we are like schools for democracy in some ways. If you join even a social club like the Elks or Rotary or something like that, part of the reason you would join that is because you would gain the skills of learning how to talk to people, learning how to do Robert's Rules of Orders, and learn how to do minutes, and learn how to manage budgets, learn how to convince people to do what you want. All these basic skills of effective human decision-making as groups of people would be trained in these. And then you could then take those skills on to bigger and broader problems. And they explicitly called themselves that, described themselves that way, promoted themselves in such terms, even when they were really just purely social clubs. And this is very different. There's lots of reasons for this change, some of them legal. I think one example of this change that I thought was quite sad, 2 years ago, the Sierra Club, the famous American environmentalist organization, removed their ability for local chapters to choose their own leaders. Right? Sierra Club was created at this time. It was created in exactly this time frame that I'm describing. And the reason they did
I don't understand that. You're saying that 2 years ago they did this, they changed. So when did they come? They were created in the 19th century. That's what you're saying.
Yeah. They were created at the turn of the 19th century. It might have been a little bit after before, but John Muir, the famous environmentalist, friend of Teddy Roosevelt, that's the era in which the Sierra Club was created. And they were originally created as one of these large-scale chapter-based organizations. And 2 years ago, as kind of part of the whole Great Awakening stuff going on in America, it was part of that internal purges of leftist organizations. They decided to do this, and they did it because if you have local leaders who are deciding local priorities, then you can't be you can't control whether or not you have some local leaders who say, actually, we think racial justice doesn't matter as much as like saving some birds or whatever. And that's what happened.
Yeah.
And then there was also another complaint
or they might say something more outrageous, which is we do believe in racial justice, but we're not sure that what you are saying will lead to racial justice.
Well, we're right. They could say that. They could say that we're involved in saving birds. This isn't like what the other organizations do that other stuff.
That's right. They could say, look, I think
the other thing that happened is there was an allegation of like one of the local chapter leaders had been involved in some sort of like sexual abuse scandal, and that's another reason why this mode of organization has failed. Not because it leads to sexual abuse, but because in a harsh legal regime. Where the top is legally accountable for what happens at the bottom.
Exactly.
Want to, strangle people with HR so that you can avoid legal culpability. And that's an important change that's kind of
absolutely. And this is, you see, the sorts of things you're talking about are also, if you read Ezra Klein's book, Why We Are Polarized, it's a very similar story. And he talks about the way in which politics is constantly pushed towards the national because the media are national, and that's essentially where people get their attention. So this is pushing away from local organisation and towards the national. It's pushing away from local context and towards crude gestures, which are instantly legible on the telly. He gives the example, you may remember the name of I think he was a senator, it was in the Senate, I think maybe I'm wrong, is the State of the Union address given in the Senate or the House of Representatives?
It's given to both at the same time.
Yes, I know that, but what chamber is it given to?
Oh.
Anyway, it doesn't matter.
I would assume it would be the House because there's more seats there. But I actually don't know.
That's what I was thinking. But I think you'll remember this. I certainly remember this. And it was a Republican congressman in the middle of an Obama State of the Union address, and he said, "You lie." And it was pretty outrageous, and it was certainly seen as a breach of tradition. And the guy picked up a couple of $1 million in donations almost immediately because everyone saw it and they thought, good, we want more of that. So tremendously corrosive of both traditions, of local context, and it's also, this is happening at a national level. So when you mention the Great Awakening, I'm thinking that may well be an important part of this development.
Yeah, I mean, the transition away it precedes the Great Awakening, but I think the Great Awakening is actually a product of in some ways of this change that we're talking about. This transition from the world of self-organization to the world of bureaucratic management. Yeah. And the reason I say that, I have a piece about this. I can send it to you when this is all done. It's called Honor, Dignity, and Victimhood, 2 or 3 centuries of American political culture. And it starts with an observation by Bradley Campbell and Jason Manning in their article on what they call microaggressions and moral cultures. I believe they turned it into a book afterwards. And they kind of make the argument that somewhere in the mid-20th century, or in the late 20th century, early 21st century, there was a change in the default, what they call moral culture, of like what is held up as good moral behavior in interpersonal relations. In the much distant past, it had been about honor and slice to honor. That's how you regulated it. Starting in the mid-1900s, going through the 20th century, they talk about dignity being the thing that people want to preserve. And if you think about something like the American Civil Rights Movement, a lot of it was about Black leaders convincing Black people that they have dignity and can stand up and need to be considered as equals. And that's why you'd come, wearing church clothes and stuff on the march.
Yep.
But in the late 21st century, you see a move to the moral person is seen to be the person who is the victim in the situation. Victimhood confers moral authority. And my speculation as why does this happen? Why does victimhood become such a key part of the way we think about politics today and also about social action? I think it has a lot to do with the fact that we have bureaucracies. Because when your job is to convince management to do something for you, the way that you do this is by demonstrating to those decision makers far above you that you are a victim in need of their aid, that you and your cause needs them to intervene and fix this problem. And if you look at like the classic examples of kind of like woke agitation, for example, on like college campuses in America, this is entirely what it is. It's not like, say, the old civil rights movement where we're going to actually like force the Montgomery bus system to concede to our demands by denying them money and doing all these boycotts. It's much more of a no, we're going to appeal to university authorities.
Yeah.
We're going to create such a ruckus and show that we are in moral need that they'll be shamed or otherwise like morally impelled to act on our side and change the rules.
Well, I mean, I think the real world force here is what is euphemistically called in management meetings reputational risk. That is, I mean, there's some legal liability questions. It's not. I think the shaming is to use economic jargon, it's an intermediate good. It's not you do the shaming and then you start the campaign. I mean, there are kind of campaigns of boycotting, but one of the things I thought you were going to say about the boycotting is that if one boycotts the buses, you suffer a lot. But you're trying to get the buses to suffer, but you're suffering a great deal yourself. Now, what's happening in most woke culture is that there's the shaming move, but then there's the mobilization around the shaming to organize essentially other people to do the boycotts, and the collectivism and all that sort of stuff. And I suppose my way of looking at it is it's pretty similar, as you can hear. But I reduce all this to a single word, which is legibility. So or to use a nice term which has been used to discuss this from cybersecurity, attack surfaces. So what management will do, so you look for attack surfaces in your opponent's speech, and that's easy. Usually someone will have said something like, surely we can agree that, ... and then a point will be put with particular clarity, and then you can say, oh, well, and then you can work on misrepresenting that. So you're trying to exploit attack surfaces, and by the same token, the managers then try to harden the attack surfaces. So I was asked to do some interviewing. I'll see if I can get it up while I'm speaking. I was asked to do some interviewing of students going to Monash University. Let's see if we can get it up. And I got a list of things that, and then I got a list of things that I must avoid during the interview. Protected attributes. These are the protected attributes. Age, breastfeeding, career status, disability, employment activity, gender identity, industrial activity, lawful sexual activity. Apparently I can ask about unlawful sexual activity. Marital status, parental status, personal association, physical features, political belief of activity, pregnancy or potential pregnancy, race, religious belief or activity, sex, sexual harassment and sexual orientation. Now let's say some of those issues I thought were important for campus life, and the example I often use is breastfeeding. Let's say I wanted to talk to a candidate. I'm not intending to discriminate against her. I'm thinking, all right, well, you've got a baby and you intend to breastfeed it. Let's talk about how you want to manage that. That would be a pretty legitimate thing to do. And if the university was interested in what it is kind of implying it's interested in, which is fairness to such a person, then they would want those conversations to take place. What they are concerned about is the capacity of those conversations to be misrepresented. And so they tell them to disappear. They just instruct things to no longer exist. Go into a world of make-believe on all of those things. And so anyway,
to do that,
yeah,
they have to create an entire separate bureaucracy to even just manage that process, right? And so that's part of my general view of how we're being socialized and what's kind of wrong is that it's not just that, like, so some conservatives in America will be like, oh, we have this like onerous federal government that's like going at people's lives. But I think probably a more important development from the perspective of the average citizen is the creation of like advanced HR bureaucracies and other corporate rules where your day-to-day behavior is being decided by somebody in a room very far away. And that's essentially like if like to give another analogy, you know, I think Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America is a really good look at kind of the old system, right? And he was very perceptive in how it worked. And he said one of the reasons that Americans follow laws, even though they're not bound up in like, you know, tradition the way that it was in Europe, is that they feel like they helped create them. They feel like they had some say in how things work. And if you are just a modern citizen in a Western liberal democracy today, you rarely feel that way, neither about the actual laws that govern you, but also just like the more regular, you know, terms of service for the social media you use, like HR rules for the corporations which hire you or the university you're in. You're ensnared in all these systems that you don't really have any agency over. It's very natural in this environment for you to feel like a victim. And really becoming a victim is the only way to change things in this environment, which is why that becomes so core to our politics on both sides, not just the left, but also the right.
Well, the right's
naturally match up. Whereas in the past, it was all about, no. We are agents. We are people with dignity. We are people who are masters of our fate. We're going to stand up to that. A lot of dysfunction in the modern world is people who do not feel like masters of their fate, and their perception is accurate. They're not really. Most of the things that decide their daily life are beyond their scope of control.
So, So I want to, I think this is a very rich vein of thinking, and I want to introduce the way I got into it, which is a bit more ideologically stripped down, I suppose. You described yourself earlier. You didn't describe yourself as a conservative, but you did describe yourself as interested in conservative thought. I personally describe myself as a conservative, liberal, social democrat, so work that out. But what I mean by that is that each of these great traditions has something to say, and if you find yourself offending too egregiously against any of them, you should be paying careful attention to what it has to say to you. But I guess my way of looking for solutions is, it's not consciously centrist, but it's consciously anti-ideological. I take ideological thinkers and conservatism and liberalism and social democracy very seriously, but I don't want to come up with a solution which I then have to say to, one of the things that irritates me, if I had to say where I was on the political spectrum, I would say somewhere to the left of centre in terms of the policies I want to suggest, more strongly to the left in terms of my sympathies, but then lots of quite right-wing people would say that as well. So that doesn't say very much. So I hunt around for things that I can describe in a neutral way and then compare with what we're doing. So that's how I come to this idea that the people around various people around the world saying citizen juries, representation by lot is a hack, an idea whose time has come. We can do great things with that. I agree with that, but I see it much more in a way that is much more. There's a much heavier intellectual architectonic, which is that every democracy is a three-legged stool. There are aspects of direct democracy. In Athens, it was the assembly. In our system, it is voting. Every democracy has two different kinds of representation, and boy, are they different kinds of representation. Representation by competition and election, which we've completely maxed out on, and therefore have made this thing a toxic mess. And then representation by sampling and cooperation, which we all have which all English-speaking countries have in juries. So the reason I mention this now is not only because I think this is an interesting thing to talk about, but because you talked about people seeing that they are involved in these laws, and so then they become invested. And I will send you. I can't put the whole thing up in the show notes because it's not yet released. But there's a documentary coming out on a citizen jury run in Michigan during COVID, and it is completely extraordinary because what you see, it is 30 randomly selected people, and you see people. You don't see any people who are incredibly woke. There are no woke activists, but there are certainly people who are sympathetic to woke ideas, and you have vaccine skeptics and anti-maskers and anti-vaxxers and to give you an idea, in one of the discussions, a number of the women say, well, if we are going to, we need the government to pay us money because we can't be employed during this time, and we think it is fair to give more money to look after children as well as adults. And this guy, one of the guys on the right says, well, you chose to have the kids. You're personally responsible for the kids. Well, as you can imagine, there's a fair bit of hefty disagreement around this point. Now, so it's not all lovey-dovey by any means, and it isn't that this method produces fond agreement, although it does produce far more changes of opinion than the system we have. But what is completely astonishing about it is, firstly, the ownership of it, and secondly, that through this process, I sound like Breen Brown, I think is her name, the woman who's promoted by Oprah Winfrey on, that through this process of vulnerability, the right winger says to the left winger, well, I believe this. And the left winger says, well, I don't agree with you, but I do respect, I can sort of see what you're saying and I respect you as a person. And they exchange this kind of respect. And at the end of this documentary, they're all in tears with how much they love each other, particularly across the ideological aisle. It's completely extraordinary. So this speaks. I've now said two things. One is this point about the social and political utility of being involved. So everyone does own these things, including if they disagree with them. And then there's this more powerful point that it's actually an extraordinary form of bonding, and it's almost because we are still living through the history of that bonding that these democracies that we have, certainly yours, has stayed together at all, really, it seems to me.
Do you feel like the random representation, for lack of a better word, is scalable?
Yes. And it's scalable in a similar kind of way. So I'll send you, I've written something on this. Firstly, it's scalable in exactly the same way that elections are scalable. That is, if you want to have a citizen assembly to discuss what goes on in San Diego, you get 50 random people from San Diego and you stick them in a room and you get them to meet however often you want them to meet and you find out what they think. If you want to know how to do that for America, you do exactly the same thing, and you have to spend more money, and you probably should have 150 people or something like that. And there are some different dynamics because of scale, but those things can be managed. The point is, these are chosen to represent us. So in that sense, it scales. There's absolutely no problem with scaling. It scales in precisely the same way that elections scale. Anyway, I think you may not be fully happy with that, so you better test me out on it.
No, I'm not. In theory, I like it. And I think that if you can't have the full body of the people, having a random selection in many ways is a better representation than an elected representation, right? And I think it would, as you said, give people more feeling of ownership over it if normal people, were involved in various parts. My questions are all just how well can you get this to I mean, my honest answer is I don't think elections scale particularly well, actually.
Yeah. They don't.
Well, you know, in as much as
they scale through national networks of media, that's how they scale, basically.
Yeah. And say the 19th century version, as we were talking about, they also had elections back then, and it was very organized in this sort of bottom up, like large scale associational network that I think worked a little bit better.
Yeah, I think so.
But you, at the end of the day, part of the problem is just when you're making decisions for 300 million people or whatever, it's always going to be difficult to have all 300 million of those people feel like, or even the majority of them, feel like they have a meaningful thing to say in those decisions. So I think part of the answer has to be thinking very seriously about,
I agree.
Well, where can we devolve issues to a lower level, and where can we have things not be centralized? Like that was one of the other interesting observations that one of these, I think it was James Bryce, who was the English ambassador to America for the better part of a decade back in the 1890s, and wrote several books about American politics and stuff. He makes the observation that one of the good things about this like vast swarm of associations that Americans have is that it allows individuals across the country, he essentially says, to be, big fish in their own pond. Everybody, like, there's so many different places where one's ambitions can be fulfilled, where one can climb up a little local hierarchy, that you have a lot less conflict. And so when I look at America, when I look at, say, Ezra Klein's polarizing, whatever, I think one of the real problems with nationalizing everything is that you actually reduce the number of like hierarchies ambitious people can climb up.
Absolutely right.
Makes conflict over a much more ambitious.
And Patrick Deneen makes this sort of point. The idea that he asks his students where are they going to end up, and how many of them are going to end up going back to the small city they came from and becoming respectable pillars of that community. And the answer is, well, that's yes, a few might, but that's not valued very much anymore.
Well, and to be fair to America, like, the United States is in a much better position than many other countries in this regard. Like, if your comparison point is something like, say, England, there's like one city where everyone goes to, and where all the elites, all the industries.
One city and one government. One city, one government, one chamber. One city, one government, one chamber, one big cock-up, basically. So that I couldn't agree more.
And not just the government either, right? Because it's also the financial center and the media center, and all the elites are very incestuous. They're all, whereas in America, it matters that our media elite live in a different city from our political elite, who live in a different city from our tech elite, who live in a different city from our oil elites. And each one has this kind of a separate hierarchy arranged around each one. And that's, I think, a very good thing.
I agree.
American life has become more concentrated over the last 50 years, but it's still better off than many other countries. And I think that's one of our like national saving graces. So let's just, I might just persevere with this, because of course, when you say does it scale, that gets me to say that I think it would work at the federal level, which I do. But of course, I see it working in precisely the sort of the nested constitutional arrangement that you have. And in that context, let's say, just as a thought experiment, that we rewrite the American Constitution, and just as most or all state constitutions are little replicas of the federal Constitution, they're congressional systems, not parliamentary systems, and so on. Let's say that each of these levels, local government, state government, and federal government, is run in this way. I think that the dynamics between these governments will be very different, because in electoral democracy is about for the participants is about the conquest of power. And of course, the thinking among the founding fathers and embedded in the American Constitution is different centers of power. So different centers of power can compete with one another, and that's a kind of second best arrangement to having governments that really try and look after us. They're looking after themselves in competing with one another. Now, if you think, let's say the question is, who should run disaster relief? I'm thinking of Hurricane Katrina, but I don't know why, except that it was such a disaster. But now, if that question is litigated in the current constitutional arrangement, it will be litigated between careerist politicians seeking to claim power and using arguments to do so, often by clearly misrepresenting those people who disagree with them. That's the currency of the game. Now,
if you have a bunch of Mr. Smiths come to Washington and Mrs. Smiths come to Washington, and there's 150 of them or 250 of them, they're not going to have that attitude at all. They're there for a year or two, and they're trying to come up with the best answer they can come up with based on their own experience, based on what people say to them, and based on what they hear. They're actually going to be trying to get the right answer. And I think that that's very far from the minds of politicians. And I say that with some respect for them because I know Wallen.
I suppose I'm probably a lot more cynical than you on this. I think that if we imagine this, if this actually happened, as you said, and I'll say this, like the difference between a jury and a deliberative body is that a jury convenes in secret. It's purposely isolated from the outside world in ways that are designed to help it, reach a decision. If you had a deliberative body on this format, everyone would know who these 150 people are. There would be intense scrutiny on them from journalists, from lobbyists, companies, from political parties.
They might do what the Ways and Means Committee did until 20 years ago, which is to meet confidentially and then to have public sessions and private sessions.
Well, I don't even think it's the matter of it's a matter of like just knowing who they are, right? I mean, so for example, if you're trying to decide, okay, does Lockheed Martin or Boeing get this defense contract? I think you would have a lot of pressure on these people from those companies, along with like financial inducements that, people who work so hard for us, we might hire them when this is all done and said.
Yeah, well, you criminalize those things. You criminalize those things. I'm not suggesting you can get rid of those things.
Would you criminalize it? Would you criminalize people who let's say I'm chosen as one of these people.
Yeah.
And then after it's done, I became a national figure by being part of this body.
Yeah, that's right.
And then I say, okay, now that I'm a national figure, I can run for election.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of your issue, is that like by putting them up at the national level, all of a sudden this group of formerly random people will now be political media corporate figures that they wouldn't have been otherwise.
Sure. Okay, slow down a bit. Firstly, I completely agree with you that that's a problem. I completely agree with you that some people would do that. I'm very disappointed to hear, Tanner, that would be you. But I'm sure that some people would do it. I think that those people would be a fairly small number, but yes, some people would do it. And there would be, I think, pretty strong pressure from within the group that this was not being very helpful. And what I would do about it, and I probably shouldn't have said, I don't really, criminalising it, there are some things you would criminalise, taking money for votes and a bunch of things like that, but I'm not really putting a lot of faith in that. What I would do is I would put these questions in the hands of that chamber. And I would say, these are issues, and that chamber should discuss them and make recommendations, and then the chamber that comes after them can consider those things and act on them if it agrees with what has been put to it. So often in these things, you have a blind break between two bodies. One proposes and the other disposes, and that the idea behind that is the same idea as when Olympic judges are voting on the diving, and the and the outliers at the top and the bottom get thrown away, and it means that all the judges are trying to guess what the other judge. It creates an incentive to try to cooperate, to try to work with others. So I think the numbers would be small. It would clearly be a problem, and I think that the body, as it generated its traditions, would be able to handle it pretty well. And I will mention one other thing. When you talked about scaling, the other thing I wanted to say, and this is something where I don't know anyone else who's keen on sortition who has talked about this, but there is a method of merit selection which I'm extremely fond of. I call it decompetitive merit selection. It was used in Venice, and I first discovered it because it was used in a large citizen jury in Adelaide in Australia. And the way it works is you don't hold an election in which people campaign. You randomly select a group of electors, and then you seclude them, and they deliberate, and they work out who they choose as meritorious for a particular thing. Now, in fact, the electoral college is a sort of bastardized version of that, and I think they may have got the idea from Venice. The problem with the electoral college is that the electors are elected, and so the electors are not randomized, but their idea was that people would meet and discuss who to appoint, and then you would end up with a leader who was a national figure and not a divisive figure. And it didn't work out, as they found out on the third time they picked a president. They had to have 38 votes, I think, before they came up with Thomas Jefferson. So that wasn't a big success. But that's a powerful way of, and it's a very abstract bureaucratic or a very abstract procedural rule, but it's trying to address some of the things you were talking about earlier and in your article about virtue, because you're not choosing people on the basis of how they can put stuff over on people, how well they campaign, how well they promise things to people. You're selecting people who other people feel have made or are likely to make a powerful and I would imagine, socially directed contribution.
Yeah, and I think one parallel or one line that could possibly be drawn between, what the two systems both of you are discussing is that, for me, one aspect of political office is not just that it enables the powerful to become more powerful, but it's a way, in a sense, of regulating the influence of people who are already out there in the community, exercising some form of influence or another, right? So, I always sort of think if you want to limit Bill Gates's ability to, influence legislation, one great solution would be to elect him to the Senate, for that would put a bunch of restrictions on him that he could no longer, kind of do, right? So it's sort of like, okay, so now looking at the system in the 19th century, you had all these local communities, and it's like, well, you got the big fish in that community, and he joins the local chapter of whatever it is, the Elks Lodge and so forth and so on. And that puts him in a system. Yeah. It's got to follow the rules of order. He's got to do, whatever it is. There's someone taking minutes, and people who can challenge him in a way that's sort of constructive. And then you build this up to these larger bodies. So I think, Nicholas, you talk about how these bodies would develop traditions that would sort of start to regulate people's behavior inside of the jury.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's very important.
There's a strong parallel there, at least from my perspective, that could be used to sort of support the idea. I also kind of like the idea of what you said earlier, Tanner, about how people just had to build their own institutions, right at the beginning, the pioneer days. And in a way, it's kind of what you're asking a jury to do. It's like, all right, guys, we need you to essentially create a kind of temporary committee for how we're going to solve this particular problem. And we're going to give you some rules, but we're not going to tell you how to do it. You guys have just got to do it yourselves. And I think that in some senses, it can be seen as a way of recreating some of the conditions that you were talking about. It's really interesting to look at these two things side by side. I do also think one question I would have, I guess, and maybe this is going a bit beyond the scope of our conversation, is the degree to which an institution where if it's purely democratically, i.e. not democratically, but like one of these chapters, which is being governed by elections, there's presumably some membership criteria involved too. Not everyone can join the Elk Society or whatever it is, or the Freemasons. These days, I don't know. But I think that one of the criticisms that we saw...
One of the aspects is exclusivity.
And that's the problem that the Sierra Club maybe faced was, we're living in the 21st century where you are saying we are kind of the victims of bureaucracies, and that's how you kind of gain some credibility. But we also have this Supreme Court that we always kind of expect to solve political problems for us. And it all kind of is related to this idea that, maybe there was some sort of misbehavior down in this local Sierra Club chapter. How can we solve that problem that if it is truly done by, organized by elected elections, how can we solve that problem of the minority interest being excluded through that process, whether it's woke interest or something much less much less, I don't know, contentious.
Contentious.
We want to we want to say this kind of bird because we really like this bird, whereas everyone wants to focus on these other birds. Maybe something like the jury can address some of these concerns. I'm not sure, but just a couple of thoughts I had listening to this conversation.
I think juries are very well placed to solve the problem of exclusion or inclusion. I think as far as associational life goes, I don't think exclusion and inclusion is that big of a deal because you always have the ability to create your own or to have one that's more specific, more defined. I think it's very hard. Like, for example, with the Sierra Club as an example, it's obviously can only ever be an organization for environmentalists. Like if everyone's included in it, then it no longer serves its purpose of environmental,
the important point.
And I think that's true for a lot of social clubs as well, or churches, or other things like that. Like they often have that part of the word ethnic club. That was a very common one. Was people from certain ethnicities. But on the question of the federal chamber, I think probably where my perspective has the biggest gap from yours is that I don't know how much procedural fixes can fix, I think, kind of some fundamental issues. Earlier on in this podcast, in the very beginning, you called the United States an empire. And when you have imperial stakes, at some level, I don't think you're going to be able to have imperial stakes a question without having just very harsh self-interested power games involved, because there's just too much money, too much world affairs, too many people at issue. One of the benefits of having something a little bit lower down is that the stakes, while important to individuals, like the ability to profit from it or what have you, is just far reduced. And so I think it's very, very, very difficult to create a procedural fix to making. I mean, people should try. In terms of this particular proposal, in the American system, I mean, the way to try would be amend some state constitutions, see if it works out very well for them. And if it does, you can expand it. That's how most, the progressive movement began in Wisconsin with the Wisconsin idea. The American federal constitution began with a series of state constitutions modeled on the same lines. That's how the American government tends to work. So I would like to see the experiment run and see how it works. My skepticism is just that I don't know how much we can use procedural fixes, especially governmental ones, when the problem is just as much a problem in, say, the corporate world, and when you still have things like a giant military that stretches across the earth, when you still have to have a Federal Reserve that decides economic policy, that decides the entire globe's economic future.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
Go on.
Very, very hard, I think, to find a procedural fix that will necessarily ameliorate, vicious fighting over what it ends up doing one way or the other.
Okay. Well, let me respond to that, because I guess I would say I don't see it as a procedural fix. I'd see it as a procedural experiment in the way that you're suggesting. Also, I wrote down as you were talking, a procedural balm. So I'm quite happy for this thing to start with no power whatsoever, and we can have a look at it. One of the things that, and I have a very sneaky power to give it, the very first power I'd give it, and I would hope that it might claim this power in the way that it would challenge other chambers to give it this power. In other words, it would just make requests. And here's the power. If the People's Chamber disagrees with the vote of one of the other two chambers, it, in the first instance, requests, and if I can get this somehow written into the rules, it demands there be a secret ballot of that chamber on the same issue. Because if I look at the experience of my own country and the experience of Great Britain, there are two great acts of elite vandalism that has taken place against the consciences of the elite itself. You would be more familiar with Brexit, but I've got good evidence that if you have a citizen deliberation, you get a swing away from Brexit from about 52-48, which is the vote for Brexit, to about 60-40 against. And it's quite obvious that I'm not nearly as close to British politics as I am to Australian politics, but I would think that in terms of what members of the House of Commons thought, I'd be very surprised if more than 25% thought it was a good idea. And yet they could be corralled into doing this by various party structures. And in Australia, you had, oh dear, is he still being recorded?
The recording light is on.
Okay, well, I'll press on. Tanner, we can't hear you. I'll actually continue this and hope that it can be edited.
You can't hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. We can't see you, but I'll just finish this. I'll finish this, and then maybe we try it. We get you to dial in again, and then we wrap up. So now I've got to try and. Oh, there you are. You're back. In Australia, we abolished carbon pricing. We had one of the best carbon pricing regimes in the world. The Conservative. It will amuse Americans to know that our Conservative Party is called the Liberal Party, and our Liberal Party got into power with a promise to abolish this tax, and as a result, Australians have to pay $12 billion more in other taxes because we got rid of that, and it was harebrained. And I'm very confident that a majority of the governing party. It was unanimous among the other parties that this was a terrible idea, and I would imagine a majority of the governing party, the members of it, thought it was a bad idea, and it happened. So that's not a fix of much. It's a patch, it's an experiment, and my argument is it's hard for me to believe that this does any harm. Since we're so obsessed with public opinion, this shows you not the opinion of the public, but the considered opinion of the public. That's something that, as a matter of information, is a valuable thing. And I think it has all sorts of qualities of sanity, which I think it can contribute. So, yes, it's not going to solve all these problems. And I think, and on the other side, it's easy for you to say that the sorts of things you're talking about would address deeper cultural problems, and I think I agree with you about that. I just don't know how to bring it about.
Well, right.
So, yeah.
That was actually my question too, just about how is it we actually get the it's the procedural bone. It's not a bad plan, but actually convincing various people to do it is quite difficult.
I just want to. If Tanner, find me a billionaire. He can give me $10 million American dollars. I'll set it up. It has I don't want it to have any power initially anyway. So we'll just do it the American way, which is we'll have to do it ourselves. We won't ask the government. Your country is much better at doing that than anywhere else in the world, for better and for worse. So there we are. We've got a solution. You're going to help me out.
That's not actually that is a kind of interesting path for it. Is create it through private funds, fund it for a few years, have it be purely advisory.
Only way you can do it. Only way you'll spend I'll spend the rest of my life talking rather than doing if it isn't done that way.
Very that's pretty interesting. So we'll see if we can find you the billionaire.
Well, you find me the billionaire. We've got an agreement here. I introduced this talk, this podcast, saying I thought we had some agreements, some creative tension. I think we've demonstrated that. You've just got to find me $10 million a year for 3 years, and you will have done not just for your great country, the great republic, but for the world. And in the meantime, we'll sort of go on with this podcast. But thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tanner.